In 1969, the father of Black liberation theology, my mentor, James Cone, asked poignantly and prophetically, "How do I remain Black and Christian?" He was making his query out of his personal and collective experience as a Black man and as progeny of slaves living in America, which is more than merely the country where we find ourselves by accident of history and birth. It is a violent social, economic, and political system, at the core of which flourishes the racist, imperialist ideology of white supremacy. Out of this and many similar questions, Dr. Cone developed a systematic Black theology of liberation that addressed the needs of Black Americans, the vast majority of whom were then and who still now identify as Christians. After his early critics panned his reliance on white theological sources, he utilized Black church traditions and Black theological wisdom to articulate his perspectives. Instead of relying on the theology of Karl Barth, on whom he had completed his dissertation research, and on Paul Tillich, from whom he had developed his method of correlation, he began to mine the musical legacy of the Black church and community that had produced both the spirituals and the blues, that had created the genre of gospel music through a combination of the poignancy of the spirituals and the rollicking critical edge of the blues, that it had created jazz from the same, and that engaged in the practice of lining traditional hymns from white evangelical culture. He also employed the confessional utterances of Black folks that harbor a wealth of wisdom. He utilized lessons from the well of intellectual, ecclesiastical, and socio-political activism that Black folks throughout our history of enslavement and systemic discrimination had built, such as Richard Allen, Jarena Lee, David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Henry McNeil Turner, and Ida B. Wells Barnett, among others, who left a body of written works that demonstrate the fact that Black people did not simply capitulate to the prevailing power dynamics and thought structures of white society, that evangelicalism, our civil religion that morally levels all of us as individuals to a standard of piety, that decenters the doing of justice from the biblical Christian message. Dr. Cone also borrowed insights from the civil rights and Black power movements that emerged out of this Black intellectual resistance as resources for systematic theology done in a new key. He spoke to the bankruptcy of the Theological Academy that had either justified the subjugation of Black people with the biblical message, or that had continued to ignore the history of slavery and the brutal effects of Jim Crow laws, voter interposition and nullification, mass incarceration, inferior education, and the crushing poverty that attended Black life, all things that are still present in the Black experience, in favor of a universalizing impetus within scriptural discourse that sought and seeks to harmonize over human experience and to crush the messages within the Bible about context and particularity, especially when speaking about the central subject of human existence, which is God. In 1975, near the onset of the sexual revolution, in the wake of political assassinations and urban riots, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, Dr. Cone asked, as a responsible theologian speaking to the predicaments of his own age, what has the biblical message to do with the Black Power revolution? Today, many people of all genders, races, socioeconomic classes, faiths, and political persuasions are asking a similar question. What has the biblical message to do with Black Lives Matter? Black Lives Matter is a new civil and human rights movement that places Black suffering and our demand for justice at the center of our own social, political, and now theological discourse. Context and particularity and their role in the development of an adequate theology are issues that are often raised in the religious academy, which seeks to protect its own notions of what is relevant and or what has eternal merit. In 1969, Cone therefore wrote A Black Theology of Liberation in order to address three considerations. One, in his seminal work, Black Theology and Black Power, he had not provided enough context for dealing with the important problems related to the particularity of Black experience. In this oversight, his critics reflected back to him that he had used the same methodologies as white theologians and had not adequately mined Black experience as a source for doing theology. 2, he himself felt preoccupied with the seemingly endless fertility of the Black experience, not merely as a slogan, but in all its rich, concrete detail. He had not appreciated the wealth of Black culture. 3rd, he needed to respond to a certain kind of critical dismissal of Black theology, typified by questions that I certainly hear when I inform someone that I am a Black theologian, that some of my students have asked, and some of you may be asking. Why do we need Black theology? Isn't theology universal? Why are we in this course centering the work of a Black theologian? Dr. Cone was personally responding to the statement of one distinguished white theologian, his own colleague, that Blacks are, quote, not free to violate the canon of exact reflection, careful weighing of evidence, and apt argument if they want to make a case for other intellectually responsible listeners. As I have said on many occasions, God is the most interesting subject in the world. Even if we wish to speak about God by offering negative proofs, God is still the most interesting subject in the world. Dr. Cone admitted that theology is universal, meaning that there is hardly a culture, there's hardly a person that does not reflect on the idea of ultimate reality. Yet he also cautioned future theologians that even though human experience is a source for doing theology, and Black experience is part of human experience, theology is not biography. Theology is rational, and I submit that it is also transrational discourse about God. In whatever ways we think and talk about God, theology is language about a universal and ultimate reality or construct to whom or to which most people refer as God. But we have to remember that theology is God talk, not God talking. It is we human beings who are doing the talking about God. Theology is a human enterprise, and it is filled with competing claims about who God is, about who we are, and about the world of vast resources that God has created. It is presumed for human companionship, stewardship, and consumption. Thus, in light of the universal reality that Christians and people of other faiths ascribe to God, Christian theology should presumably address universal questions, like the question of suffering or theodicy, and Christianity should thus proffer universal gifts of salvation, enlightenment, and the cessation of suffering. But Cone also argued that theology as human discourse about a universal and ultimate reality is always particular, coming out of a particular interpreter's particular context, particular experience, particular vantage point, particular interpretive lens, particular school of thought, out of one's particular race. And because of this revolutionary insight, we may now say that theology as human discourse always comes out of reflection from the vantage point of one's particular gender and particular sexual orientation. Cone further argued that his colleague was blinded and bound by his whiteness. And in the context of America, that means having the presumption of uniqueness and being the definitive standard of everything, from beauty to intellect to theological acumen. This oppressive privilege is quite opposite of what makes theology specifically Christian, which is, according to Dr. Cone, the liberating character of God's presence in Jesus Christ. According to Cone, the task of the theologian is to clarify what the church believes and does in relationship to its participation in God's liberating work in the world. In doing this, the theologian acts in the roles of exegete, prophet, teacher, preacher, and philosopher. Reading Cone, learning deeply from him, our purpose is to recenter the doing of justice in the way we do theology, as exegetes, teachers, preachers, and philosophers for the world in which we live actually, not the world in which we imagine we live. As an exegete, simultaneously of Scripture and existence, the theologian has the right and responsibility to probe the depths of Scripture exegetically for the purpose of relating that message to human existence. The epistemological break with Western methodologies proposed by the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, of which Dr. Cone was a founding member, does not necessarily mean foregoing the use of the tools of historical criticism which come out of European Enlightenment. Rather, it means recognizing the limits of historical criticism, becoming aware of one's own contextual boundaries, and not privileging those methodologies over meaning-making among the least of these. It also means that if Scripture is to be a mirror of human existence, or as Dr. Cone states, if Scripture is to be reliable, not infallible, then the theologian as exegete must allow the text to reflect back who one is in the narratives, whether as oppressor or oppressed. And if the gospel is meant to liberate bodies and souls and not to inscribe or reinscribe oppression, then the theologian as exegete must be willing to see all oppressive human conditions as antithetical to the good news. As a prophet, the theologian must make clear that the gospel of God stands in judgment upon the existing order of injustice. God is not indifferent to suffering and not patient with cruelty and falsehood. Dr. Cone said that. To him, this is the clearest indicator that God is on the side of the oppressed and that there are no neutral prophets. As a teacher, the theologian is an instructor in the faith, clarifying its meaning and significance for human life. Like the apologists of the first century, a theologian in the 21st century has an obligation to be a defender of the faith, showing its reasonableness in curing human indifference to suffering, and also in the face of vacuous and speculative metaphysical assertions about the nature of God. As a preacher, the theologian is a proclaimer of the word, recognizing the passionate character of theological language, a language not only of critical analysis and judgment, but also of celebration and joy, that the word of liberation was made flesh and was acted out in the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth. Finally, as a philosopher, the theologian is also a keen observer of alternative interpretations of the meaning of life, precisely because when speaking of things divine, it is difficult not to speculate. Observing other people's rituals, reading their scriptures, and learning about their sources of resilience keeps one intellectually honest and open to other perspectives and lays the groundwork for dialogue with people of other faiths. In each of these roles, the Christian theologian must do theology from the standpoint of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, asking the right questions. The basic question is this: what has the gospel to do with the oppressed of the land and their struggle for liberation, for justice? If you fail to place that question at the center of your work, you have ignored the essence of the gospel. Dr. Cone stated this: unfortunately, not only white seminary professors, but some blacks as well have convinced themselves that only the white experience provides the appropriate context for questions and answers concerning things divine. They do not recognize the narrowness of their experience and the particularity of their theological expressions. They fail to recognize that other people also have thought about God and have something significant to say about Jesus' presence in the world. So while Black theology is contextual, in that it reflects on the Black experience in America, is primarily Christian, and was in the first instance articulated from a masculinist perspective and a heterosexist perspective, with the presumption of sexism, it nonetheless carries within it a universalizing impetus by not arrogating to itself the presumption of universal relevance, but by acknowledging its particularity and its relativity in the world. And it so encourages us to name who we are from whatever experience and vantage point we come to the discipline of theology.